So today I'm making a quilted blanket. It will be a chessboard for these large pieces that my husband bought. These chess pieces are 8 inches tall and have a diameter of 3 3/4 inches. For the white squares, I'm using this white duck cloth, and for the dark colored squares, I'm using this suede-like material that is left over from a bag project. I'll be using this thicker upholstery fabric for the backing, and I will make the borders black. So commonly, the squares of the chessboard are about 75 to 80% of the king's base diameter. These kings are 3 3/4 inches, and so the squares should be approximately 5 inches. I will be adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I need to cut squares that are 5.5 inches. The chessboards are 8 by 8 squares, so a total of 64 squares, and so there will be 32 squares of each color. So the first step is always to prep your fabric. I am just ironing this down to get the wrinkles out. And then I fold the fabric in half and start cutting 5.5 inch strips so that I can then cut out the 5.5 inch squares from that. And once I have 32 squares of the white, I will cut out 32 squares of the suede fabric. So I place the squares right sides together, and I will be sewing strips of 8 squares alternating between the suede and the white. And here's what it looks like with the whole row finished. I then press the seams open and iron them flat. And then you repeat this for the remaining 7 rows. And since this is a checkerboard pattern, I made sure to line up the rows in alternating pattern. I then pinned all of the rows together. You can pin and then sew each row and then pin the next row in, but I just did it all at one time. And then I sewed all the rows together. Afterwards, I ironed the seams open just like I did for each of the rows so that the blanket will lay flat. I ironed my backing fabric and placed that on the floor, and then placed the batting on top of that. I pieced together my batting from several smaller batting pieces just to use up some of my leftover scraps. And I laid that out as smoothly as I could over the backing piece. Ideally, you'd want to do this on a table, but I didn't have a table big enough. And then I laid the quilt top on top and smoothed it out and pinned it into place. Usually you would use safety pins here, but I just used straight pins. For the actual quilting process, I added this extension to my sewing machine to give me more working space. I also decided to quilt using this clear nylon thread. I also filled a bobbin with this. Because I didn't want the quilting to be obvious, I stitched in the ditch along all the squares. I started in the middle of the blanket and I worked my way to the sides. So I would sew one row, move over, sew the next row, move over. When all the rows were quilted, I would turn my blanket 90 degrees and sew the columns. After all 3 layers had been quilted into place, I then cut off the excess borders. I was originally going to use my black fabric to make bias tape, but I ended up cutting it too small, so I used store-bought double-fold bias tape for this project. I opened up the bias tape and put it right sides together with the quilt top and sewed with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. In order to make the mitered corners, I stopped sewing a 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric. I folded the bias tape at a 45-degree angle to the right, and then folded it back upon itself again, back down towards the other edge. I would recommend pinning this in place, but I just went ahead and sewed it down. I started at the edge of the fabric and sewed with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down the edge. And then here's another example of how I did the mitered corner. So I folded at a 45-degree angle and then folded it back down to line up edge. When I get back to the start of the binding, I sew the 2 end pieces together at a 45-degree angle in order to decrease the amount of bulk at that seam. I cut off the excess fabric and sewed the rest of the binding down. To ensure that the front side of the quilt is neat, I used a 1/4 inch wash-away sewing tape on the back side of the fabric to hold the binding in place while I sew. I remove the backing of the tape, place it along the edge of the quilt, and then fold over the binding and iron that into place. And now I can turn the quilt over so the top is facing up and stitch in the ditch so that the stitches are going through the top of the quilt, the batting, the back of the quilt, and the back of the binding. And here's the final result. And just for fun, I've included the famous opera game from 1858, which was played at an opera house in Paris. The American master Paul Morphy played against 2 strong amateurs, a German noble and a French aristocrat. It was played as a consultation game, with the German noble and the French aristocrat jointly deciding each move for the black pieces, while Morphy controlled the white pieces by himself. The game was played in a box while an opera was performed on stage. Morphy quickly checkmated his opponents following rapid development of material involving a queen sacrifice. It is among the most famous of chess games. The game is often used by chess instructors to teach the importance of piece development, the value of sacrifices in making combinations, and other concepts. It is unclear which opera was being performed while the chess game was played, although some sources have indicated The Barber of Seville or possibly Bellini's Norma. I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial. And if you would like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. Thanks.